Number 1. I'm a 19-year-old male, and I've had my fair share of paranormal encounters, most of which weren't pleasant, but there's this one encounter that I don't know how I should feel about. My grandfather had a mansion on the outskirts of the city, and we would go there quite frequently, and mostly spend the summer there. There was a lot going on at that place that we couldn't quite explain. To give you a little bit of an idea about the place, it was a mansion in the middle of nowhere. We had no neighbors, no houses within a couple of miles, and even the closest gas station was about a 20 to 25 minute drive away. It was quite the remote and silent place. So one day, we go there again, and I go out into the garden and play by myself, as I always do this since there was no family members that were my age. Then this kid suddenly approaches me. This is a kid that I've never seen before in my life. He doesn't talk, and he doesn't smile. His face has a blank expression on it that I will never forget. He proceeds to grab my football, soccer ball to some others, and pass it to me in a manner that he wanted to play. That's when we spent about 30 minutes or so playing. Now that's an important detail, and although I was 5, I was pretty good at keeping track of time since my family was a bit protective. I heard my mom calling my name a couple of times, and I always replied, "I'm in the garden. I'm playing with my new friend." But she would keep calling as if she couldn't hear me. I decided to let it slip and kept playing for another 5 minutes, and then left to see my mom. When I went home, my mom asked me where I had been all this time. I said I was in the garden playing with my friend. She didn't make much of it, since I was 5 years old and could have possibly had an imaginary friend. This kid kept visiting me every day for the next week or so. Once, he even brought his mom along. Similar to her son, she would not speak, and she also always had a blank expression on her face. So one day, as we're playing as always, and it had not been more than an hour or so, my mom was calling my name as usual, and she was walking around the garden looking for me. I thought she was playing, but I got really irritated when she walked right past me, right in plain sight, and didn't see me. I immediately ran to her, and she turned around to face me. Her face was as pale as snow, and she immediately let out a sigh of relief and told me I'd been missing for the past 8 hours. The thing is, I would go missing just like that every day for the past week or so. I said I was playing with the kid and told her it shouldn't have been more than an hour. She finally told me, "Son, we have no neighbors. There's no houses within a 15-minute drive. Besides, the city's an hour away. What are you talking about?" Eventually, the kid and his mother stopped visiting me, and we let it go. We later found out that there was an old graveyard beneath the foundation of the house. We immediately sold it. A couple of months ago, my mother told me that she was once visited by that same kid and mother I mentioned earlier. She said they just stood there and did nothing. They were just staring at her the whole time. So, dear little kid and his mom, I don't know who or what you are, but let's not meet again. Number 2. This is something that happened when I was about 12 or 13. So at the time, my mother worked graveyard nights at the prison, and my dad wasn't in the picture. So as you can imagine, I was alone most nights, and didn't really see my mom all that often, except for on weekends. She generally left for work at about 4 and got home at 6. I was really into a book series at the time. I don't recall the name, but it doesn't matter. And I was laying on my bed reading it. My bed was just a mattress and a box spring, and the door was at the foot of the bed, with about 2 feet of space between the two. There was also a vanity on the opposite side of the room, so I could see the door and the mirror from my bed. So as I said, I'm laying in bed, engrossed in my book. Every light in the house was off, because it was about 9 or 9:30ish at night. Plus, I did have a book light. My door wasn't closed all the way, because I had no animals to keep out of my room like I normally did. I had a cat before, but unfortunately, it passed away a few months ago. But I still had it open a little bit. So as I turned the page of my book, I saw in the mirror out of the corner of my eye something was off. So I turned my head to look at it and saw a shadow dart away. I thought nothing of it. I barely registered it because my door was open about 1.5 feet. At that point, there was a sudden realization, and I heard my door slam open and felt something cold on my ankle. Next thing I know, I was being dragged down the hall on my back. I couldn't see anything, and naturally, this scared me more than anything in my life. I tried kicking away, and I put my hands and elbows against the carpet, trying to slow myself down. I tried to scream, but all that came out was a squeak. When I got to the end of the hall, I finally stopped. I was too scared to move for about 30 seconds, but once I regained control of my body, I ran straight to my room again and turned on all the lights on my way. I lit candles and closed and locked my door. I didn't leave my room until it was light outside again. I never did tell my mother what happened, as I was too scared to tell her. Nothing like that has ever happened since. Number 4. The only thing I remember about my first house was incredibly odd. We didn't have a dog yet. Now, I remember sleeping on my parents' floor because I was too scared of the bed. Yeah, I know it was kind of weird. Sometime that night, there was a loud crash, and a dog came in and laid by me. Well, that morning, there was no dog, and the sliding glass door was completely shattered. So fast forward a bit to the new and current parents' house. I moved out long ago. As a kid, I was incredibly frightened by the dark, only the inside of the house. I was also scared of lightning and thunder. Well, every time a storm rolled in, I would sleep on the floor again in my parents' room. I always felt something watching me from under the bed. Now, whether this was a childish fear, my cat or nothing, I never figured it out. Waking up in the middle of the night when I was on the floor was a very common occurrence. Every time I would wake up, I would hesitate to look around, and of course I would always cave. About 75% of the time, I would see this figure standing across the room. He had a very light color, in the shape of a large man, in a trench coat of sorts. At the foot of my mom's side was the walk-in closet. On my dad's side was the bathroom. It would stand at whichever one I was currently on and not move. I, of course, would go underneath the covers. Occasionally, I would go for a midnight snack. I could feel the same thing, or just something else close by. Sometimes, it was catching me standing in the entrance to the living room. But this time, there was no light color. There was just the absence of color. It was a pure black shape. Well, I never did get snacks at night again. One night, I was up late playing video games, and I heard the sound of one of the silverware drawers open violently. At first, I assumed somebody was getting a snack, and pulled it way too hard while being half asleep. Then I heard a spoon or something drop, and then another. And then if it's like somebody took the whole drawer and turned it upside down. Then the cupboard opened and some glass shattered. I muted everything and laid there still, and didn't move. Everybody was asleep except for me. I thought to myself, even my cat can't lift any of that stuff. Plus, my dog is too short to even reach the drawer. That morning, I go out to get a drink, and there's a triangle cut out of glass. A perfect triangle. No cracks or anything of the sort. Everything else was in its place. Now, I'm not the only one. When my dad had a broken back, he was house-ridden and would always see what looked like people going in and out of the two back rooms, theirs and my sister's. There's actually a picture floating around of a black figure above my sister sleeping with the lights on. My mom would hear voices as she came home. She would feel things, and a few times she would see what appeared to be a person's figure darting across the backyard fence. Things ended up moving on their own. And the creepiest moment she had was one night home alone, with the window cracked, working on a scrapbook. That's when she heard a scream from somewhere, so she went to investigate and found nothing. Shortly after it happened again, but with such an intensity, she said it felt like the window shook. One night, I was cruising back to my room with my fresh hot chocolate to resume my gaming session. That's when I heard something. As I crossed the bathroom, I heard a deep raspy voice come from inside there. Now I should mention, it was an incredibly dark room. It was faint at first, then it said come over here much louder. I spilled my hot chocolate all over myself as I darted into my room. A few weeks later, it happened to a friend of mine. I vaguely remember the door handle shaking on some occasions. I experienced sleep paralysis a few times there as well. The two most vivid ones were me being completely squished by something much larger than a normal human should be. The other one was more or less the same. Both times, I was helpless and couldn't scream. Another night, I had a nightlight on, and the shadow kept darting around the lower half of my room. Now, I should probably point out that I was the only one in there, as my cat never came in. Plus, my cat definitely couldn't fit under the dresser. I even checked at first. Well, I stopped sleeping with a nightlight after that. Another time, I was riding my bicycle at night across the street. This house was constantly unoccupied. People would move in and pack up and move shortly after. Well, I heard a knock on the window that was facing the driveway. There was a dark figure there, and it was waving at me. Needless to say, I noped out of there. Another day, a house across the wash, behind the house on the neighboring street, had the same occupancy problem. We built a treehouse behind it, and frequently, you would see the blinds move despite being vacant. Whoever lived there before left decent furniture. Well, one day, I was walking in front of the vacant house across the wash and felt uneasy. I kept glancing at the middle window, and on the third glance, I could swear I saw somebody's face. Well, at this point, I had enough of all the paranormal happenings. I decided to use an Ouija board and try and get some answers. Unfortunately for me, though, it didn't really do much. But thankfully, at the end of the day, the paranormal activity finally calmed down. So yeah, needless to say, at the end of the day, I've had quite the interesting life with all these paranormal happenings. Number 5. Now, when I was 10 years old, we moved into a new home. We, that is me and my mother, as my parents had divorced years before. It was a completely new house. We were the first people living there, but it was literally built between two graveyards and the ruins of an old town. To explain, the town where we're living in was over 1,000 years old, but the old town had burned down and part of it was never rebuilt. That new house of ours was basically located next to the forest in which those ruins were. I'd say they were about maybe, 150 meters away from the ruins themselves. But the ruins were never notorious for hauntings, so I didn't really think much of it. But it was not long after we moved in there that some strange things started to happen. At times, I saw a shadow girl standing behind me when I looked in the hallway mirror. At times, I also saw a face looking through my window at night, even though my room was way too high up for anybody to stand outside. There were also multiple instances where single books had been standing way back in the bookshelf, like 10 centimeters away from the edge of the shelf, and just fell out. As I said, I was notoriously afraid of ghosts and anything the like, so you can imagine how scared I got back then. My mother, of course, would never believe me though. She thought I saw those things exactly because I was afraid. Hence, I was always really thankful when both my aunt and uncle would come and sleep over. You see, when they came for Christmas, they'd sleep in my room. They also claimed they heard banging from beneath the bed, something that I never experienced. Later, when friends stayed over, they too saw the face in the windows, and one of my friends, who stayed over more than once, also saw the moving books at times. There were also some other scary things happening at times. For example, I back then unwittingly had recorded EVPs, without even knowing what EVPs were. You see, as children, me and my friends used to use cassette recorders. This was the 90s. We'd use them to record audiobooks ourselves. We would read a book aloud with everybody having some characters to read for. And 2 or 3 times it happened that when we listened back to the audio tape, we would not hear our voices. Instead, we would hear a male voice speaking Latin. It spooked us so bad back then. What really spooks me out today is the fact that I have no explanation for that Latin voice, especially as that Latin track was very audible, and at least one time went on for about 3 minutes. But quite honestly, I got used to that kind of stuff happening. And while I was afraid, I kinda got the feeling growing up in that house that those spirits never meant harm to me. Especially as there was one other thing that started happening after about 2 years in that house. I would see a very clear male apparition at night in my room. This happened several times and always when I was alone. And I always had the feeling that the spirit was actually watching over me. I kinda made peace with those spirits, and they never harmed me. Actually, when I did see that apparition, I tried speaking to the spirits, and while I never got a verbal reply, the books never moved again after that. So all in all, while sometimes there would be some creepy things happening, it was not really too negative. Well, that changed when I moved in with my boyfriend, when I was 18 years old. Back then, I moved to another country. Now, the new apartment that we got was suspiciously cheap. When we moved in, we noticed something rather strange. And yes, This sounds pretty much like something out of a horror movie. There were crosses literally all over the place, like literally everywhere and on almost every wall. The landlord told us that the people living there were into some pretty weird things. But then things started happening. Doors would be opening and closing on their own, and at times, a door would be locked, even though there were not even any keys around for the door. Books would move, things would even disappear. Well, we would even see an impish-looking figure walking around the apartment. There would even be lights turning on and off. There would be banging from atop the apartment and even orbs. Now I should probably mention, we were at the top of the apartment, so nothing else was above us. But that wasn't the worst thing. At times, mostly in the evening or at night, there would be a very, very big shadow in the kitchen. Now, not a shadow person, but just a large, formless, entirely black shadow. To be honest, it was quite horrifying. Now, there was another problem. There were no paranormal societies around. Even researching around, we found only one in the entire country, and they were nowhere near us. So I first asked somebody I know, one of the few German ghost hunters I know. In fact, one of the even fewer German ghost hunters who have made it on TV. He told me that I should try again to talk with that thing. Bad idea. We tried, and from then on, we would be woken with the bed rattling, or the door opening and then slamming closed. It was stuff like that. So at this point, I was just sick of it, and I was really desperate to find answers. So, one of my good buddies from the United States told me about all these groups in the US that could possibly help. I did get one reply from them. They were telling me to sage the entire apartment and put sea salt in the doorways of the kitchen, as a lot of stuff seemed to come from there. We did so, and things didn't stop, but they did become weaker. There were at least no more visual things going on, and we were not woken up at night. Still, I was just so happy when I got to move out of there. Back then, I'd actually be afraid of things following me, but thankfully, they never did. Since I moved out of there, I spent 7 years without another paranormal encounter. Well, apart from one of my former neighbors getting problems when he started to renovate his house, there was nothing more. Funny enough, over the last few years, I have done some paranormal investigations together with said friend. We even got the chance to investigate one of said haunted castles with full equipment. The castle was notorious for being haunted, but they actually wanted to rent out some of the rooms to students, because there were just too many students in town to accommodate otherwise. Yet for whatever reason, the owner of that castle was a bit afraid that this would not sit well with the spirits. So we went in there for several nights and found, well, absolutely nothing. We were in there with 8 people for a total of 3 nights and not one paranormal thing happened. I was almost a bit disappointed, to be honest. So yeah, that's a bit of my experiences. As I said, I really don't make it up, even though it sounds a bit cliche at times. I kinda wish I would have been better advised with the paranormal back then, as I am now. I've thankfully overcome my fears with the paranormal and been able to properly document things. But of course, that was the last thing on my mind back then. Number 6. I have had a few fair experiences. I can't say for sure they're paranormal, because I'm a big believer in that our brain is untold power that can explain many of the things that have happened, but many of these experiences are set up for interpretation. I'll start from the first encounter I can remember and work my way through the years. Ages 3 to 9. My first cat had been run over when I was 3 and dragged back to my back door by another cat. Ever since then, I had seen my cat sit at my bedroom door and walk away when I chased it, just to disappear. It never disappeared in front of me, of course. It just turned corners before I did until it was gone. We moved around 5 times, but I still saw that cat in every house. Now age 6 to 8. We're in a new house. It wasn't old. It was around 30 years old. This is England. That's nothing, of course. My older sister had the first pick of rooms, and she chose one with a cupboard inside. Inside it had a little window and a little shelf that I could easily sit on. The cupboard itself wasn't scary, but after a few months, I refused to go into it. I really don't know why, but my sister would push me towards it to scare me, and I'd throw an almighty fit if I got within 3 feet. Now, the same house. The hallway outside her rooms faced my bedroom head on. The stairs had 2 steps at the top, a triangular step, then they would turn out of eyesight. Many times I saw shadows dancing up the steps, Dancing assumed because their shadow bobbed and weaved. It wasn't my mom or sister. Both their rooms were on either side of mine. I slept with my door open. Also, I had a hard time sleeping at night, so I'd lie awake staring at the glow of stars on my ceiling, and I hadn't heard or saw them make a noise at all. I also heard noises in that house, arguing, whispering, singing, and even my name. Now, I used to think it was my sister, until one morning I walked down the stairs after hearing my name the night before, and saw my mom shouting at my sister for being all out at night and rocking at 7 a.m. After that, I slept with my door closed always. Now age 10. While sleeping in my mom's room, I was a very scared child. I woke up to see a ball of cloudy blue light, the size of a marble hovering in front of my face, bobbing up and down, and then it flew backwards into the chimney. My friend and I were in my room playing with a dollhouse and Pokemon. It was usual for my mother, only myself and my mother lived together from then, to leave the house with me in it and go shopping for a cup of tea at her friend's house. She wasn't in the house when myself and my friend turned to my bedroom door to see it being turned upside down, and frantically as if somebody was trying to get in. Not 30 seconds after my mom walked in the front door, we started seeing and experiencing these things. We called my mom up because we didn't want to walk through the door. She of course didn't believe us, but a week later, it happened to her own bedroom door, right in front of her. The same house was a nightmare for me. For some reason, it made me incredibly nervous and scared, so I spent as much time as I could outside. The hallway was the worst. As you walk through the front door, the front room is straight to the left, with an L hallway to the right, and to the bathroom and kitchen. The stairs were 5 feet in front of the door, and both bedrooms led off to the left and right, so there was no real hallway upstairs, only a window directly in front of them in between the bedrooms. Whether it was daylight or night, and I walked up there, I had the most horrible feeling in my stomach, like I'd eaten a freezing rock, and I had to run. Age 12 to 15. My sister was in her new house with her 2 children, and I frequently stayed there overnight. From the first week up until she left that house, I would dream every night of her 3rd bedroom, my nephew's room, except it was no longer his room. 2 children, a girl my age and a boy around 7, would stand in the room and stare at me. I was standing in the room facing it, my niece's room, and thought they didn't speak in the dream. I still knew what they said though, or so I thought. They would try to make me come into the room, but even in my dream, I was so scared, so I wouldn't even budge an inch. They didn't want to hurt me, but they wanted me to be with them. They were both average looking, nothing too special. Normal clothes, normal faces, basically the norm. But the entire room, them included, were bathed in odd blue light, as if strong moonlight was shining through a thin curtain. I never told anyone about it, and never will. To me, that was the worst experience after the wall thing. Age 14. We had moved yet again to a large flat apartment in the same city. Again, the hallway scared me. I'd see the shadows of feet beneath the crack of my door, constantly pacing. My door had painted over window thing at the top, and if the bathroom and hallway light was on, I'd see it bobbing up and down. Again, I must say, I'm a very scared person when it comes to the paranormal. One part of my brain has a logical explanation. The other part, though, is constantly screaming ghost. So because of this, from an early age until now, I sleep facing the wall. It's honestly like I feel like I'm being watched, which is all the time. I will cover my head and refuse to move. Now in my bedroom, I always felt a weird presence, and I'm not sure how to explain it, but it felt as if there was anticipation in the room, like when you're a crowd, all waiting for the music to start, and there's a feeling of anxious energy around you. It always came from one corner, and happened during the day as much as night. I had a built-in wardrobe in that corner, and I used to put a coat hanger through both handles because I was absolutely convinced something was trying to get out of it. Same place. I was asleep and facing the wall, and whether it was a dream or not, I can't be sure. I woke up to stare at the wall, and in front of me, inside the wall, was a black space the size of my head. It honestly sucked all the light out of the room and forced me to stare at it. I couldn't move my eyes away at all. I couldn't even move an inch. I never did see anything inside of it, but I felt like something was trying to reach me and pull me inside. If I didn't move, it would happen. Now, the reason I don't know if I was dreaming is because I don't remember waking up after I woke up. I only remember staying still and watching until very early in the morning when the light finally came on. I pushed myself out of bed so hard that I hit my back on my nightstand and knocked everything off. I couldn't sleep for weeks. I moved my bed, slept everywhere except my room, and told nobody for years. It never did happen again. Age 23. My best friend and I went into a graveyard at night. You see, we were pretty bored, and plus she had dared me to go as well. I can't remember what we were doing there. I think it was mostly to read names or something. It was a graveyard I frequently visited. After a while of fooling around, hiding behind trees and scaring each other, we heard the sound of a baby crying. It sounded like a full-on painful cry. Because the graveyard backs onto a garden, we ended up both running to the fence to see if there was a child in the garden. There was nothing. No lights, and the crying stopped. It sounded like it was right next to us. As soon as the crying stops, we see flashlights from the community officers. I guess somebody had probably heard us and ended up calling them. Now, this next bit is unbelievable. Had I not seen it, I'd think it's a lie. Here's some details about it first, though. At the very back of the graveyard, there's a few feet of trees. Then there's a brick wall. It's around 3 feet tall from our side. The other side is a 6-foot drop to stop people from getting over it. Recently, a car had plowed right into it and knocked around 3 feet of it down in one place, leaving a very sizable chunk gone. We had planned to go through that hole, jump down, and run up the residential road and hide in a garden. I'd personally checked to see if the hole was there before we had started messing around. You see, there had been a lot of vandalism recently, so police presence was expected. However, when the flashlights and crying happened and we ran to the hole, not a single brick was out of place. Not a single one. We couldn't even get over it. The 6-foot drop was too big for us. We had to duck and cover between headstones and make our way around the outskirts of the graveyard and hop over the sectioned off wall that held the public toilets. That's when we would wait for the car to leave. Now, my friend would never speak of it. Every time I mentioned it, she'd turn away and ignore me until I dropped it. Fast forward to now, age 25, in a new place again. Previous occupant was an old woman. Now, I knew nothing of her, and was told she had moved to a care home and was alive. The place feels cozy and bright, not scary at all. It was the first place in my life to end up feeling that way. Even after what's happened, it still does. I was in the kitchen making a sandwich. The door is directly to my left, which leads to the hallway. The bathroom is again directly to the left of the door. My bedroom door is 3 feet to the right of the kitchen door. As I'm making a sandwich, at the corner of my eye, I see the top half of an old woman. She has a bright yellow cardigan on, and although I can't make out her face, I can see she has her gray hair pulled back into a bun that sits at the crown of her head. She walks from on the right, my room I assumed, into the bathroom and walking past the kitchen door. She isn't walking. I suppose she isn't gliding either. It's kinda hard to explain. It's as if she's all on one level, slowly going past another conveyor belt. Now I know it sounds dumb, but that's how it looks. Now I'm frozen, ready to run away if something happens. But nothing happened at all. After a few minutes, I drop everything and leg it into the living room. A few months go by, and I wake up to the sound of banging. It sounded like when you're a kid and you're holding a stick and banging against a wall. It's that annoying banging sound, except it was against a radiator. I could see the radiator I thought was coming from, but nothing was happening except the noise. This radiator had worked before. You see, the central heating wasn't on, so it wasn't water running through it. But it could have been a heating fault. I'm not sure. All I know is it went on for minutes and stopped, exactly when my mother walked inside the door. I've experienced a lot of weird feelings, seen a few other things, but most of it can be explained. My mom and sister, however, have seen bizarre things. But anyways, that's enough paranormal things for now. Number 7. I started my career working in sawmills back in 2007. I was hired for a portable sawmill in southwest Washington state. This mill was located quite literally in the middle of a forest. It was constructed in the early 70s, and even in the short 30 years of its life, it seemed to have a decent amount of history inside of it. I worked the weekend graveyard times, 2:30 to 4:30 a.m. on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. I was a trim drop operator. I had a partner who I worked with, and we were the only two in the area. His name is Pete. We would take turns rotating through the night. One of us would run the drop, where you would drop out bad boards, chunks of garbage, and just about anything else that couldn't be made into quality lumber. The boards that would be left to be processed would enter a lug chain system, and then be pulled through a scanner, then through a trim box that would cut the lumber to length, and then in the next area, it was the sorter. The other of us would sit at an operator's console, about 20 feet away, and watch monitors that displayed various parts of the machine and the process flow. We rotate every few thousand boards to keep them from being fatigued. One night, I was running the drop, and Pete was kicked back at the console station, reading away at the newspaper. Everything was going just as normal as ever, when I glanced over and noticed him peering up at the monitor for the outfeed with a puzzled look on his face. He jumped up and went walking down to the trimmer saw box and looked around it. He then walked back looking quite concerned, sat down, shrugged, and started reading again. This happened a second time, and by now it had my attention. I threw up the skids to stop the flow of the lumber and walked over to him and asked him what was up. He pretty much said, "Dude, there was a guy standing at the outfeed. I went down there to see what was going on, and when I got over there, he was gone," he told me with a confused look on his face. Now, this didn't make sense, because this was an area that wasn't accessible unless you stopped the machine and activate a catwalk that unfolds. I asked him to point out where this guy was hanging out. Pete pointed to the platform, slightly frustrated. I shook my head at him and laughed, before running back to the drop to continue running lumber. Pete stayed fixed on the monitors now, newspaper folded up and thrown to the side. Not but 5 minutes go by before he jumps up and runs down to the sawbox outfit again. This time, I threw the skids up and followed him. By the time we got there was nothing. He pointed across the lumber table, which was 30 feet wide, to the platform across the machine and yells, "Hey, who's over there? You're not allowed to be over there." Both of us waited to see the man he had seen on the monitor, but once again, there was nothing. After a minute or so of looking on, we decided to move back to our stations. I walked by the console station, glancing at the monitor, seeing nothing, and Pete followed shortly behind. By the time I made it to the drop to start running again, Pete howled. I snapped around and saw him pointing to the monitor with his finger, yelling for me to come look. I ran over and looked into the monitor. Sure enough, there was a guy. He was standing on the small platform Pete had pointed out. Now, this monitor is small, grainy, and black and white, but we're able to work out that this guy is wearing a tin hard hat, a very dirty and worn button-up long sleeve, with the sleeves either rolled up or ripped off. Also, he had very thick denim jeans of a dark color. He's just standing there, with his elbows on the handrail, looking at the lumber from the sawbox. "Wait here," Pete yelled, as he stealthily snuck down to the outfeed once again. As he closed in on the outfeed area to catch this guy red-handed for being in an area you can or shouldn't access while in operation, I looked back and forth at Pete and the monitor. About the time Pete made it to the sawbox, the man on the monitor looked up into the camera and literally just faded away. I completely lost it at that point. I felt a cold chill run down my back, accompanied by all the hairs on my arms standing up. I sprinted as quickly as I could at Pete, exclaiming, "Dude, that was not a guy." Pete just stood there, dumbfounded, both of us now looking onto the platform with our own eyes. "What should we do?" I asked, quite disturbed now. Pete crossed his arms and thought, before deciding we should call our foreman down and tell him this story. We walked back to the operator station, and Pete grabbed the microphone of the radio and called for the foreman. We ran until he arrived, both of us ready to bolt for the sawbox in case we saw it again. The foreman didn't show up for another 5 minutes, and we stopped running and explained what had happened. The foreman didn't look impressed, but he was smiling. He explained that we had seen one of our old-timers. You see, back in the late 70s, we had a man who worked there, who ran the chip bin station, and one day, arrogance got the best of him, and well, long story short, he got buried, and of course, unfortunately, was crushed. The foreman said he was one of the only people to ever work here and wear a tin hard hat, as homage to his previous career as loggers in the woods. Other operators have had occurrences where they've witnessed this entity wandering around different machines, seemingly just watching the flow of lumber. Number 8. This is part 2 and a continuation of my previous story. So, my job on the trimmer continued on for some time, after my first encounter with the strange happenings in that mill. After about 3 months of running the trimmer, I was approached by the foreman with an opportunity to move to a different spot in the mill. He said it entailed more money, and that was basically all I needed to hear. I moved downstairs into the basement cab, known creatively as the basement cab. This was perfect for me, I thought, because as much as I liked working with a partner, this was honestly a one-man type of job. Once you've got the training, you were left to your own devices. The basement cab was centralized in the center of the mill on the ground level. You see, the mill was 2 stories. The first floors were all the waste conveyors that traveled throughout the mill were located. If one of these conveyors plugged up for any reason, it was the basement guy's job to get it operational as quickly as possible. Aside of that, other duties were to wander around down there in the dark by yourself and look for anything that may cause a plug up or a jam. The cab itself had dozens of monitors that overlooked quite a few different conveyors, but foot patrols were still necessary. The cab came complete with all the commodities required for sitting for literally hours and doing nothing, including a heater, AC unit, decent stereo, microwave, and even hookups for a DVD player. There was also the ability to switch input selections on one of the bigger and newer displays for the conveyors. The basement in general was hotter during the day and cold as ice at night, and at all times, irregardless of what time it was so humid down there. The humidity also promoted a healthy supply of various types of wall mold. There were areas that were frequently flooded with a few inches of standing water, accompanied by the typical smell of rotting wood material. The areas that were lit were done so dimly, spiderwebs peppered all of the light fixtures, and even one cast an eerie pale yellow glow in an attempt to eradicate the darkness. Lights would frequently burn out or flicker due to the vibrations and crashes from the mill up hammering away like there was no tomorrow. Having been put down there by myself after the first incident at the trimmers, I prepared as best as I could for any future encounters, but tried my best to not think of it for a while I was down there. Typical practice was to patrol with a flashlight due to it being so dark, and carrying a picaroon with you. A picaroon, for those that don't know, is basically an axe handle with a bludgeon similar to a hammer on one end of the head. There's also a point-like pickaxe on the other end of the head. This was for grabbing anything that needed to come out of the conveyor if anything was discovered. And besides that, you generally feel more secure with something like this cradled on your shoulder. You also had a portable radio with you, as general practice was to carry one when you're by yourself. You see, the basement could easily be a dangerous place. One night, just after lunch, I was headed from the parking lot back to the basement cab. I walked through a big set of double doors that are left cracked open wide enough for a person to slide through. I squeezed through the doors and pulled my light from my vest and click it on, and began my walk down the hallway. The ground in this area is always covered in fine sawdust that constantly falls due to the machine on the floor overhead. Even after just sitting with coworkers and laughing, eating and the such, once I walk into the basement, I feel the environment change. This particular time, it got heavy and crowded. I turned around, flashing a light at the doors I'd come through, and shined the light from them down to the ground and up to my feet. I was noticing 2 sets of fresh footprints, mine that got all the way to where I was standing, and another set that just stopped 2 paces behind me. The other thing is, I hadn't been through there twice. And in any case, the sawdust erased new footprints within an hour usually. I remember feeling my stomach instantly drop like a sack of potatoes. I charged down the hall and into the central basement, and straight up a flight of stairs to the sawmill floor. That's where I then spent a lot of the night hanging out at a different operator station, reluctant to go downstairs for anything. Now this next one, I'm not sure if it can be called paranormal or not, but you can be the judge. Being especially bored on a lazy night, I venture up to the sawmill floor and make my way to the quad cab. The quad is set of 4 gigantic band mills, about 20 feet tall, arranged in a way to cut slabs off logs. The quad operator is a man who went by the nickname Opie. He was an older guy, really gruff, and had absolutely no patience for anything or anyone at all. But he always had interesting tips and pointers to share with the younger generation. The conversation we had this time led me to mentioning feeling uneasy about the basement. I remember him looking at me with a sinister grin and spitting out, "Just bring me that phone back there. Bring that thing over here right now. While of course pointing out behind me into the back of the room. In the corner was a stack of computers that were servers for the machine, and on a table next to the tower of computers was a pile of cups, gloves, hard hats, work tools, garbage, and other things that had been there. I moved a very dusty coat to the side and discovered a corded phone. It looked like it had been torn from the wall and hurled into the corner. I picked it up, dusted it off, and brought it back to Opie. What is that thing? That thing won't leave me alone. Watch this. He grabbed it from me and reached over to his left shoulder, plunging it into a phone line after digging around at a mass of cords on the wall. He then sat on his knees and said, "Now get ready, because it's going to be for you." Within a matter of seconds, the phone rang. It didn't finish ringing once before, where Opie ripped the handset off the base and stuffed it in my face. I felt really uncomfortable at this point. I put the handset to my ear and said, "Hello?" very cautiously. My eyes are locked with Opie's as I hear what sounds like somewhat distant raspy breathing. Cupping the receiver to my head led me to further conclude that I was indeed hearing breathing. I tried getting whoever was on the other end to identify themselves. And that's of course before Opie tugged the cord away. I handed it back to him and hung up on the phone. Some 10 seconds later, the phone rang again. He then explained that the ringing got so bad that he just ripped it off the wall. He said a real long time ago he threw it into a corner. The phone is just wired to communicate with the foreman in his office, and on the weekends, the foreman is never in his office. Anyways, after all of these happenings, it's safe to say that this place is haunted. It's definitely not somewhere I like working anymore. Number 9. About 5 or 6 years ago, me and my friend had been at a birthday party of a friend. We had some moonshine, or better yet, only he did. I barely drank. That's before we found out that we had to walk home. This was at the other side of the town we live in, so we had this very long walk. The clock was about 3 a.m. when we got to the school I went to. After the school, there's this long road thing for people who walk or ski. It's located on a mountain kind of thing, kind of like a hill, but very long, and there's a forest and all that kind of thing. It honestly takes about 40 minutes to walk through the whole thing. Before we enter the forest, we smelled this awful, disgusting smell that we had never smelled before. Either way, we continue walking. Now, this is winter in northern Norway, so it's really dark, and the trail we walked on was very dark too. There were some light lamps, but it didn't really help much. To the sides, it's just trees, and you can barely see the front. So we walk, but we don't really talk. We were very tired and had walked over an hour, but something took my attention. There was really creepy whispering noises, like there's a lot of people around. Kind of like you could hear the voices, but you couldn't hear what they were saying. Just the vowels. I first thought it was the wind, but this was constant. It didn't stop. And don't even get me started with the atmosphere. It was insanely eerie, and it felt so sinister. I had tried to ignore it because I thought it was just my imagination. The more we walk, the louder and harder the violent the whispers get. We're just walking, as we're just two boys in the woods, surrounded by Dolby surround sound whispers from beyond. When we get to the halfway point, there's this bench with a nice view over the hill, but this night, nothing was nice. As we got there, we hear a woman scream in the forest, the direction we're supposed to be going in. After all this mental torture by constant whispering, I just break. I get scared and I panic. I get a breakdown and start saying, "Dude, what's going on? Aren't you hearing that whispering?" Well, you want to know what he replied? He said, "Nah, dude, I don't hear anything." So we just continue walking, and the whispers are everywhere still. I was sure I was going crazy. When we get to the end of the forest, there's this long hill down. It's very steep. We get forced to run because of it, while trying not to fall in the snow. We run down and stop in the middle of the hill, and we catch our breaths. Yeah, we weren't really sporty people. So we're just standing here, catching our breaths, when we look at the top of the hill. I get shivers from writing this, but there is a woman in a white dress with black hair standing there looking at us, watching down. My blood froze completely. She just stared at us, before she turned to her left and took 3 steps and vanished. Now, I've never ran so hard in my life. I've never even been afraid like that before. While walking back, my friend told me he heard the whispers all along and said, "Well, you're not supposed to speak about it when you're in haunted areas," or something like that. We also talked about how the whispers sounded Russian, but they didn't sound like a man or a woman. They were just all around us, not just coming from a single direction. Fun fact, there's a graveyard next to this forest road thing, and there's also a big memorial stone. Fun fact too, when I was in 6th grade, we had a teacher who said he was skiing through there once around midnight, and that's when he saw a man in a big fur coat walking in boots there. In the end, he thought to himself, "Well, I'll outrun him," and eventually pass him. He gave his all to try and outrun him, but next time he turned, the man was closer. I never did believe him until after what I experienced. Now, I know it's a big cliche that there is a woman in white, but honestly, that's what I saw. Also, I recently told this story to a friend. He told me the smell might have been sulfur, which would have meant it was something bad. When I finally realized this, I finally got a sense of fear, a strong sense that I haven't felt in more than 5 years. Number 10. My friend Tommy and I used to go to graveyards with my recorder and cameras, just to mess around, trying to catch stuff and scare ourselves. There was this one tiny graveyard that was just like a cutout from some woods, that was on the side of a back road. You see, we'd go and visit it often, mainly because of its age, and also because of the ritual-looking things in the back right corner. One night, Tommy got his own recorder, and we decided to go there with his girlfriend and her friend to go and mess around for a minute and test our new recorders. He drove, and we pulled in and parked where we always did, and got out while the girls refused to because it had started to rain. So for some reason, I went to the back of the truck and see that there was a small gravestone that we never noticed. It must have been because we parked there all the time. I called Tommy back and showed him the gravestone. He said, "Sorry, Mr. Gravestone, no disrespect." Now, both of our recorders were already running, and caught him saying that. We started walking towards the back right corner, where there was a whole bunch of stuff. Halfway there, we were both startled by a voice. His recorder was playing back him apologizing for parking on the grave a minute ago. Both of us laugh, and I call him dumb, but he swears he didn't hit anything. Now, his recorder is lit to show it's recording, so we don't know why I would have played it back. He stops it and presses record again, and we keep walking. We get to the back right corner, and there's nothing new of ritual variety or anything, so we just decide to hang out and do the anyone present kind of thing for a minute or two before moving on. Now, this cemetery has a very distinct heavy feeling that everybody feels every time, and this was no exception that night. I wouldn't say I felt anything different than usual, but Tommy did. As we started getting to the far left corner, whole place is maybe 100 to 150 feet wide, he's getting weird and saying that he thinks he's just going to go to the truck. I call him a baby and convince him to just come to the end for a minute or two. As I look at him, he's walking sort of lean back, and while it's obvious enough to notice it's not drastic, I figure because of the ground and all the wet stuff, it's harder for him to walk, and of course keep his balance. We get over to the far left corner, and instead of just headstones, there's full body length slabs of concrete style graves, which we usually sit on and hang out on because the heavy feeling grows a bit over there. We're there for maybe 30 seconds. He just isn't having it and tells me he'll go back to the truck. He looks spooked, so I didn't joke about it and hung out by myself there for another minute or two before heading back to the truck. On the way back to his house, he says he's sorry, but he just had a really bad feeling there that he felt sick to his stomach. Then he said that he didn't want to mention it at the time, but when we were heading towards that left corner, he felt like he was being pushed forward towards it. He also said that he was surprised I didn't notice it, because he felt like he was walking hunched forward. When I told him I noticed, but he was hunched backwards, he looked genuinely shocked, and just quiet for the rest of the ride home. We got back to his house and he felt back to normal and everything, so we decided to listen to the recordings. We started them so that they were playing in sync, but the weird part was that when it got to the part where his recorder had started playing back his apology, we both had that recording. I turned mine off, and as we rechecked it, sure enough, his recording has his voice played back and us talking about it happening. It then turns off from where he stopped it. His other half of the recording matched mine, and we didn't catch anything. But of course, we can't explain how his recorder would have recorded and played it back at the same time. There was nothing in the instructions saying you could even do that, and we couldn't even replicate it. We had no idea. He swears to this day that something was pushing him towards that back left corner too. What was there in that corner? I'll never know. I just wanted to go ahead and say thank you so much to all the Patreons who donated this past month. Thank you so much for donating, guys. And for those of you guys who do donate, you guys get some pretty awesome cool perks and rewards, like getting my videos way earlier than everybody else, getting my autograph, and even getting a personal handwritten letter from myself. So if you haven't checked out my Patreon or haven't donated, then make sure you guys do, as like I said, I've got some pretty cool rewards and perks for you guys that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Other than that, guys, thank you very much.